Hey, good morning. First of all, I just have to apologize to the 4 people who are here to hear Peter this morning. I'm just so sorry that I'm not him. I really, really love Peter's preaching, and I'm kind of bummed that I don't get to be here to actually hear him. I have to hear myself instead. But just thank you for just the gift of getting to be a guest preacher here at One Hope Church this morning. I also need to apologize. So some of you may know my name is Michael, and my day job is to lead Thrive, which is the Gig Harbor Cross-Church Young Adult Ministry. And you may not know this, but we are stealing Peter in about a month from now. And he's going to be gone speaking at our fall retreat. So we're making him do 4 talks. I mean, this is like some serious heavy lifting. And so I just hear it from me first. I'm sorry that we're stealing your pastor, but we're really, really excited that he agreed to come and speak for us. So it's just, the nice thing about Gig Harbor is that all the pastors in Gig Harbor tend to know each other and to be friends with each other. So sometimes you do these little exchanges. So that's how I'm here this morning. Okay. So one of the fun things about getting to be a guest preacher is you usually get to pick your own subject, and I got to pick my own subject this morning, and we just got to hear the passage read from 2 Timothy. This is a favorite passage of mine. When I was first being, I guess you could say, discipled, this was one of the very first books that someone ever introduced me to. And so I'm not going to read it again for you, but I want to just make some introductory comments about why I wanted to land on this particular part of Scripture this morning. And the first thing I want to say is that what we just heard is Paul's last letter. This is Paul's swan song. This is his final opportunity as the greatest theologian that the church has ever had to pass on the treasure, really, of the gospel. And if you would think, if you're in Paul's shoes, it's a pretty big decision how you're going to spend the last, who knows, maybe months of his life. Who would you have written that final letter to? If it were me, I probably would have thought in terms of, what would be the biggest church that I could write to? Or what would be the most influential church? Maybe it would have been the church in Rome, at the heart of the Roman Empire, one of the very center points of where the gospel spread from. Why would Paul not have written to a church like that? And yet instead, what we just saw in verse 2 is that Paul tells us that his last letter is written to Timothy, my dear son. I think, I got to turn it on. I never use my own clicker. Oh, there it is. I found it. Let's see. Oh, there we go. See, look. Haha, slides. If you guys have ever heard me preach before, you might also know, by the way, I almost always use this font when I preach. It's called Avenir Next. It's a great font. I'm into fonts. Just, anyway. Just wanted to, give you guys some regularity in your life. Every time Michael comes, he uses the same font for his slides. So anyway, the point is, Paul chooses to write his last letter not to a church, not to a multiple group of people, to one person, just one person, to Timothy. And here's the implication I want to draw out of this to kind of frame what we're looking at this morning. The God of the Bible is a God of relationship. He's literally Trinity and unity, the Father by the Spirit loving the Son, and the Son by the Spirit loving the Father. Right? God is a God of relationship, and relationship lies at the very heart of this last letter between Paul and his beloved mentee, Timothy. And what I want to do this morning is I want to look at this passage through the lens of relationship. And I want to show you not just how relationship functions in this passage, but how relationship is pivotal to what it means to know and to love and to follow Jesus. So here's the way I want to look at this morning. I'm going to break this down just in terms of 3 Ps. This is the other thing you might know if you've heard me teach before, is I love kind of, the Baptist alliteration thing. I'm not a Baptist, but, I like those guys just love their alliterations. So the profile of relationship, the power of relationship, and the person of relationship. And this first one, the profile of relationship, what I want to do first of all is I want to zoom in to see something about the kind of relationship that Paul and Timothy had here. And by way of introduction, we have to know something about the context in which this letter was written. So I already said that this was the last letter that Paul wrote. A lot of people think it was written probably around the year 64 AD. That's a significant period of time because it was around this time that the Roman Emperor Nero had begun to persecute the Christians. And in fact, just to give you a picture of how awful this was, there's a Roman historian named Tacitus who tells us that under Nero's persecution, believers, Christian believers, were torn apart by wild animals. They were crucified out in public. Some of them were even coated with pitch and set on fire to serve as human street lamps. And it was during this period of persecution that, according to church tradition, both Peter and Paul, the two greatest apostles of the early church, were both publicly executed themselves. Paul by beheading and Peter by being crucified upside down. And so in the letter of 1 Timothy, I'm so sorry, this thing is just, I never know how to use these things. In the letter of 1 Timothy, Paul's writing to Timothy in order to show him how do you lead a church in a time of peace. But in 2 Timothy, he's writing to Timothy about how to lead a church in a time of suffering and widespread apostasy. And, just the very fact that in this letter we actually have some indications that Paul was on death row when he wrote it kind of confirms this. So, for example, if you look at chapter 1, verse 8, or chapter 2, verse 9, you find out that Paul says that he's imprisoned as he's writing this. Or in chapter 4, verse 16, he says that he's been put on trial. And then, and most importantly, I want you to notice, if you have a Bible open, look at chapter 4, verses 6 through 7, where Paul says here that he believes he's going to die. I'm just going to put this up on screen so you can read along with me. In one of the most moving passages that Paul ever wrote, here's what he says. He summarizes his life in these words. I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I've kept the faith. And just one more way I want to illustrate just the background in which these words were written is just by way of this little graphic up on the screen. And this simply shows you the difference between when his first letter to Timothy was written and his second letter to Timothy was written. And you can see that by the time 2 Timothy comes around, things are hard, things are dark, and the future of Christianity almost looks like it could be in question. So the curtain's coming down. Paul knows his time is short, and he decides that the best use of that time is evidently to write to his friend. And I'm going to examine a little bit more what that friendship was like, but just before, as I do that, let me just establish one observation first of all, which is that the fact that Paul and Timothy had this kind of closeness is actually something that I think has been lost and is missing in our culture today. In our hypersexualized culture, this is something we no longer have categories for. And it's a male friendship marked by depth, emotion, and passionate love for Jesus. And so let's look at this. Let's look at the depth of relationship that these two guys had. First of all, let's look at it through this angle, the angle of what Timothy meant to Paul. And then let's look at it through a second angle, which is what Paul meant to Timothy. So what did Timothy mean to Paul? And then what did Paul mean to Timothy? So first angle, what Timothy meant to Paul. Look at verse 3. I thank my God whom I serve, as my ancestors did with a clear conscience, as night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers. So what do we learn here? Well, he says that Timothy is someone whom he constantly remembers. Think about someone that you constantly remember. Maybe it's your spouse. Maybe if you're under the age of 30 and you're not married, maybe it's your crush. Or maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's your mom. I'm not sure. But memory is the index of affection. The way that you know that you have deep affection for a person is that they're on your mind. You constantly remember them. Let me illustrate this for you. How many of you have ever been scrolling through Facebook or something, and you know how you sometimes will see someone post about some sort of tragedy that's happened to a friend or a family member. If it's someone that you don't know very well, and this is kind of preacher's confession for public consumption here, at least what happens to me is if I sometimes see a post like that and it's not someone I know very well, I might read the post, I might even pause for a few seconds to pray for that person, but I kind of move on with my day after that because I don't know them very well. But now, imagine this. Think of a time when, it's one of your best friends or someone who's really close to you. You find out some terrible piece of news about something that's happened, and it's on your mind all day. You can't get it out of your head. You might completely drop everything, rearrange your schedule just to be there for that person. You're constantly praying for them. The more you love someone, the more you're going to remember them. And so look at how deeply then Paul must have loved Timothy. He says, I constantly remember you. Okay, observation number 1. Observation number 2, look at verse 4. He says, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. There are a few things that I think make someone feel more valued than knowing that you bring someone else joy. So for example, a number of weeks back, I was in the Safeway parking lot. I had like a big fistful of grocery bags. And I was trying to load the grocery bags into my car, and I hear someone from behind me just say, Michael! And I turned around, and some guy that I hadn't seen in a while, who was a friend of mine, just noticed me in the parking lot. He came up and wanted to talk and give me a hug. And I was trying to awkwardly let me put these grocery bags in the car and also acknowledge that I'm excited to see you and all that stuff. But it kind of made me feel appreciated that here was someone who was very clearly excited to see me and to run into me. And he had a huge smile on my face. The point is, you know that you're loved, you know that you're valued when you can tell when someone has genuine joy being in your presence. Timothy's presence gave Paul joy. And now this is actually pretty striking to me. You got to remember, Timothy and Paul are not exactly equals in a sense. Timothy was someone that Paul had mentored. It wasn't that Timothy was mentoring Paul, Paul was mentoring Timothy. And I bring this up to say that one of the ugliest things that I think can happen to a Christian is when they begin to realize that they're being treated as a project. If someone feels like, they're just being ministered to and not really genuinely loved, you can smell that from a mile away. But Paul doesn't treat Timothy like this. He doesn't treat him as a project. He treats Timothy as a person and as a friend whom he deeply loved and cared about. Now, let me just ask the question, what do you think underlies this kind of love? Why does Paul love Timothy with such affection, such depth? If you look at just some little clues throughout Scripture, I think you can kind of put some pieces together. And for example, in Philippians chapter 2, verse 20, this is a really lovely, beautiful statement that Paul makes about Timothy. He says, I have no one else like him. And then in the next verse, he goes on and says, for everyone looks out for his own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. Translation, I think what he's saying is, he's saying, look, alone of all of my coworkers, Timothy is the only one who isn't in it for himself. He's not out there just to get things. He's not doing this selfishly. Timothy has a genuine heart for the Lord. And I'm going to take a guess here, but I don't think Paul is saying that his love for Timothy, his affection for Timothy, it's not just pragmatic. I don't think he's just saying, I love this guy because, his heart's in it, and so he makes my ministry a lot easier. Man, I wish I had that many, guys who I could sucker into, to giving their heart and soul to help me out here. No. He's saying, he's not saying I just love him as a colleague. He's saying, no, the reason I love this guy is because at last, here's a man who's a man after my own heart. Here's a man who shares the love for Jesus that I know. And so it was a passionate love for Jesus that knit these two men together in a profound and beautiful friendship that echoes throughout the pages of the whole New Testament. There's nothing more precious than a friendship fueled by shared love for Jesus. Do you have friends like that? If you're married, your spouse is your friend. Is your marriage characterized by that? That's what Timothy meant to Paul. But then there's the other angle, which is the angle of what did Paul mean to Timothy? Let's kind of look at it from the opposite side. Look at verse 4 again. This is something that Paul says of Timothy, recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. Now, okay, what probably I think he's referring to here is that this may very well be a reference to the last time he and Timothy were ever together. And they both would have probably known at that particular juncture that this might have been the last earthly reunion that they ever would have had. They're both serving Jesus in the middle of a time of persecution. As soon as you part ways, you may not see this guy ever again this side of eternity. And evidently, Timothy was so overwhelmed by this final parting that he wept. Recalling your tears, I long to to see you. One of the things I've noticed about myself, this is another confession. I've noticed that as I have gotten older, I cry more easily. I am a man here this morning. I am publicly admitting to you all that I just get more tearful the older I get, and it's even begun to happen in public now, which, whatever. But I'll tell you, the reason that I most often wind up teary-eyed or whatever, I cry when I feel loved. You know, and that's what's really going on when like a piece of music moves me or when a film stirs me. Almost always, it's not just because like I'm sad or I'm moved by whatever the beauty is, but it's because something in the beauty that I'm seeing reminds me of what it's like to be fully known and fully loved by God. And so, just there's a lot of beautiful things in the world that remind me of how I'm fully loved and fully known by God. It makes me cry. And I'm going to speculate here a little bit, but I'm going to surmise that one of the reasons why Paul's departure brings Timothy to tears is because Paul had taught Timothy about Jesus. One of the things that I love about Peter is that Peter and I both love to quote Tim Keller. Maybe you've noticed this about him. Maybe you've noticed this about me. I remember one time I was speaking somewhere, and it was somewhere I speak pretty regularly, and I think I just, mentioned I was going to quote something that Tim Keller wrote, and someone laughed. And I thought, oh, they know me so well. They're just laughing at how much. Anyway, but the other day, a couple weeks ago, I wound up watching the live stream for his memorial service. And it was such a Christ-honoring service. It was lovely. There were not very many references to him. There were many references to Jesus. But there had been some remembrances about him that people had shared a number of months back when he passed away. And it made me think back to the many tributes I saw on the internet that were posted about him. I want to read you one of those, one that stood out to me when I saw it. And this was someone who was deeply affected by Tim Keller's preaching and wrote about a time that he got to meet him while he was attending a conference that Tim Keller was speaking at. And I want to read you this quote. The quote says, during a quick intermission, I was invited to meet Tim briefly for about 5 minutes. Extremely nervous and standing about a foot shorter than him, I was introduced, shook his hand, and made a little small talk, which I'm awful at. But I knew I wasn't leaving him before telling him one thing. It still brings me to tears now as it did then. I looked up at him and told him in a shaky, quivering voice, Tim, I just have to tell you one thing. You made Jesus beautiful to me. And he looked me in the eyes, and in his gentle and similar choked-up voice, nodded and quietly said, that's the point. I think that's such a cool tribute. It's one thing for a preacher to teach you the truth about Jesus, but it's another thing for a preacher to show you the beauty of Jesus. And I wager that is what Paul did for Timothy, in what he taught, and how he lived, and in how he loved. And to lose a guy like that, to lose a friend and a mentor, someone who had shown you Jesus, moved Timothy to tears. But let's look at one more clue for what Paul meant to Timothy. And this actually takes us to point number 2. So the profile of the relationship, you've seen a little bit about what their relationship was like, but the power of relationship. What was it about this relationship that was so impactful? Look at now verse 6. For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. So this tells us something pretty interesting about Timothy. I mentioned earlier that if we read between the lines, you can get some idea of why Paul knew that Timothy desperately needed to hear from him in his final days. At the time that this letter was written, a little bit about Timothy's background. He's probably still in Ephesus. Now, Paul had left Timothy in Ephesus and had charged him with pastoring the church there. Now Ephesus, it was the gateway into Asia Minor. This is modern-day Turkey. The population of Asia Minor at that time was likely in the millions of people, and Ephesus is the major city. So this is an enormously important call that Timothy has. It's a pretty difficult call. I mean, this would be like, Paul taking you to the center of downtown Manhattan and saying, start a church. Or, going to this, downtown Seattle or downtown Chicago and saying, pastor a church there. It'd be pretty difficult. And this is all happening, as we've already said, in a context where things are getting harder. there's persecution in Rome. There's potentially persecution in Ephesus as well. The father figures of the church, the apostles, are passing off the scene. And then, this is actually a really relevant detail that is mentioned in this letter. Look at chapter 1, verse 15. Paul says, "You know that everyone in the province of Asia Minor, everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me." So now think about this. Previously, Paul has spent 2.5 years, he's been preaching the gospel in Ephesus so that all who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. That's what the book of Acts tells us. But now, it would seem that these same people who heard the gospel, maybe even believed in the gospel, they've now thoroughly rejected it. And in fact, there's one commentator who puts it like this, that to every eye but that of faith, it must have appeared just then as if the gospel were on the eve of extinction. So think about this. How would you like to be Timothy? It's like all the wonderful gains that you'd seen made in the city of Ephesus have evaporated. People are leaving the faith in droves. Today we use the word deconstruction. I don't know what word they would have used back then, but he was living in that kind of context. And so here's a guy. He's a young man. He's young. He's probably feeling pretty inexperienced, and he's under enormous pressure. He's in a pressure cooker, and evidently, it's gotten so stressful that he's wanted to quit. He's wanted just to walk away, just to leave it all behind, to give up his calling. So into this whirlpool of discouragement come Paul's words that we just read. "For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands." Now, Timothy, from what we know, is a pretty timid person. 1 Corinthians 16, there's this great little line where Paul is writing to the Corinthians. He says, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you." What does that tell you? It tells you that here's a guy who's a bit of a coward. He's a little fearful. One commentator speaks of Timothy's retiring disposition. He was young. He was shy. And he needed a word from Paul, therefore, to tell him, don't you neglect your gift. Fan that gift until it roars. Now, by the way, there's a really cool lesson here about the grace of God. Grace changes people, but it changes people in different ways. For some people, like Timothy, you need grace to make you bold. You're naturally a little bit fearful, and you need grace to give you courage. But for other people, you might need grace to make you gentle. This was probably Paul's position, where Paul, from what we can tell, was just a force of nature of a personality, and he needed grace to gentle him, to make him less abrasive. A good mentor is someone God brings into your life to help the grace of God work on you in the ways that you need it. Paul needed a mentor like Barnabas who would soften him. Apollos needed mentors like Priscilla and Aquila who would teach him. But Timothy needed a mentor like Paul who would embolden him. And so he writes verse 6. And here's why this matters so deeply. In verse 5, there's another little pivotal detail about Timothy's background. And in verse 5, he tells us, "I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded now lives in you also." And in this list of Timothy's, the people who influenced Timothy, you see his mother, you see his grandmother. The fact that they're mentioned by name tells you that these were probably spiritual giants in Timothy's life. But conspicuously lacking in this catalog of Timothy's faith heritage is any mention of a father. There's no spiritual fathers mentioned in his life. And in fact, if you go to the book of Acts in chapter 16, verse 1, you find out that Timothy's the child actually of a mixed marriage. His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was a Gentile. And from what we know, there's no indication that his father was a believer. So just think about the vacuum that would have left in this young man's life. This is why it's so important that Paul speaks words of affirmation into his friendship with Timothy. Because what does a father do? What's the role of a father? I like to think, when it comes to this question of the great scene in The Lion King, where Simba, who is supposed to be the rightful king, after his father has been murdered, he gives up his dream of being the king he was born to be, and he disappears into the jungle. And, thank goodness he did, because we got some great, Disney songs out of that little moment. And you got, Timon and Pumbaa, two of the most lovable Disney characters ever. You wouldn't, it's all thanks to this moment. But, he disappears into the jungle, and he lives like an outlaw. I mean, he refuses to grow up. He's kind of like Peter Pan. And really, the reason is because he's living under shame. He's convinced he can't ever be the kind of leader that his father was. And so what does he do? Instead of facing his fear, he just hides in this perpetual adolescence. But if you've seen the movie, you know that the thing that changes everything for him is, it's that great scene where one night he's looking up at the sky, and he sees a vision of his father. And remember what his father says? His father says, "Remember who you are." And some stuff with Rafiki happens. Anyway, he gets encouraged, right? And he goes back and he becomes the king. But what he needed was a word from his father. His father saying to him, "Hey, remember who you are. Remember that you're the king. Remember that you're my son." A father is someone who names you. Even Jesus, at the beginning of his ministry, needed to hear his father say, "You are my son, whom I love. With you, I am well pleased." There's a deep, deep need for all of us to have a father figure affirm us, to speak life over us. And that's why when a girl has a father who tells her that she's beautiful, she'll grow up with a greater self-esteem. Or when a boy has a father who tells him that he's got what it takes to be a man, he'll grow up with a stronger self-image. And so Timothy, flailing about in his doubts, desperately needs that kind of father like Paul to speak his true identity over him. And notice even in the end of verse 6, he mentions that this gift of God that he's calling out in Timothy is in you through the laying on of my hands. If you go back to chapter 4 of 1 Timothy, there's another mention of this particular gift. We don't necessarily know exactly what the gift might have been, but in 1 Timothy 4:14, Paul says to Timothy, "Do not neglect your gift, which is given you through a prophetic message, when the body of elders laid their hands on you." Now, it's possible that this is actually the same event that Paul's referring to here, that at some point there was a group of spiritual leaders who came around Timothy, and through the gift of prophecy or some other way, they somehow imparted to Timothy his gift as a minister of the gospel. But that's why it's so interesting that here in verse 6, notice that all the other elders have dropped out. Paul says the gift is in you through the laying on of my hands. He's drawing his attention to his personal involvement in birthing Timothy's call. And I think the reason for that is because it's a token of their relational history. Paul's reminding Timothy that he was there when the call came. And since that day, he's gotten to watch as Timothy has stumbled through all the stages of Christian growth, from being a baby Christian to being a gangly teenager to maturing into a young man, and to being a new but inexperienced pastor in the front lines of ministry. And in fact, all told, by this point, their relationship already goes back something like 15 years. We've all had people who've tried to like come up and encourage you. Someone comes up and just, you can tell they're just trying to like make you feel better. And sometimes it doesn't really feel better. Sometimes it just kind of falls flat because you may not know that person very well. They may not know you very well. It's like, so nice of them to try to make me feel better when I'm having a really bad day. But, what if someone who truly knows you comes up and says that? What if someone who's watched you grow, who's seen you struggle, who's intimately familiar with all of your fears, what happens when that kind of person comes up to you and says something that just speaks deeply into your heart and into your soul? When that kind of person encourages you, you believe them. You believe them. That's the kind of impact that Paul has on Timothy's life. That's the power of relationship. And I'm going to just draw out one final point here as we close. Number 3, the person of relationship. Okay, so far, hopefully it's been obvious. The theme, in some ways, of this first part of this last letter of Paul is relationship. And I want to look at one particular kind of relationship that I think is particularly relevant in the life of the church. And the word you could use to describe that is the word mentorship. In the United States, the standard model for training people to do church ministries, you ship them off to a seminary far away from the community that nurtured them. And for a period of about 3 years, you're supposed to sit at a desk and read hundreds of books and write dozens of essays and accumulate lots of valuable and important theological knowledge so that you can preach the gospel faithfully. Those are all good things. However, that model is not in the New Testament. It's been said that there's only one seminary in the New Testament, and it's 2 Timothy 2, verse 2, which says, "The things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others." Now notice what you find here in this New Testament model of training. There's 4 generations of gospel proclamation here. Number 1, the things you've heard me say. So you got Paul. And then those things were passed on to you, to Timothy. Number 2, entrust to others, reliable men, that's 3rd generation, who will also be qualified to teach others. So you got 4 generations right there. Here's the observation to make. This model of ministry is fundamentally relational. It's relational. It's based around personal mentorship, personal relationship. And so just in the last part of this talk, I want to just reflect on what this passage teaches us about how you, yes, you sitting here today, can step into this kind of reality. How can we become spiritual fathers and mothers, sisters and brothers, who leave behind us a whole generation of Timothys, who aren't just a bunch of theological talking heads who have lots of knowledge, but who actually have experienced through relationship with you the love of God, the fruit of the Spirit, and the truth of the gospel. So in other words, how do you become a person of relationship? Let me start with a question here. The question is, right now, how does Jesus shape your relationships? How does Jesus shape your relationships? I ask this question because I think one tempting answer that is so tempting, especially in this particular moment, in the life of the church in the United States of America in the year 2023, there's a temptation in the Christian world to base your friendships with other Christians around theological debates. Theological debates. You naturally want to gravitate toward other people who are from your same theological tribe, and maybe even your same political tribe. And so that means that much of your shared experience of Jesus isn't actually based around shared experience of Jesus. It's based around agreeing or disagreeing over things that you believe intellectually. And there is a place for that. That seminary is probably that place. Just all the late night conversations around the table about all the Calvinism and Arminianism and all those things. But can I suggest to you that that is not the material of which true Christian relationships are made? And in fact, can I suggest to you that actually some of the richest Christian relationships you might have might very much be with another person who disagrees with you? True Christian relationships, including mentor relationships, are based around shared love for Jesus. Shared love for Jesus, shared love for the gospel. And look at the contrast in 2 places in this letter that illustrates this. So this is chapter 2. This is a great verse for American Christianity right now. Don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments because you know that they produce quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not quarrel. But then by contrast, here's the verse right before. Flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. So what's at the center here? It's not quarreling, it's not arguments, it's love and devotion to Jesus. That will shape you into a person of love, into a person of relationship. Now, just 3 quick words that I want to use to practicalize this. The 3 words: grace, time, and sincere. Grace, time, sincere. The first word is grace. One of the ways that you know that God is shaping you into a person of love, a person who has the capacity to be a spiritual father, mother, sister, or brother, is grace. People are messy. I'm messy. You're messy. We're all messy. And if you want to help someone come to know and love Jesus, if you're actually wanting someone to help you come to know and love Jesus better, then you are going to have grace for each other's failings. And the deeper and more potentially transformative that relationship is, it actually is going to be even messier. So grace is the key ingredient. Like when you make cookies, you need a lot of different ingredients in there, but if you don't have flour, that's like the one you need the most of, you're not going to have cookies. If you don't have grace, then you're not getting anywhere. Number one, grace. Number two, time. Now, I want to think about mentorship specifically with this one. Here's a question: how do you disciple someone? How do you do that? How do you come alongside someone and help them know and follow Jesus better? Paul's answer to that question would not be reducible to just mere knowledge transfer. It wouldn't be just mere skills training. In the foreground of his discipleship method and of Jesus' discipleship method was relationship. Do you ever think about how, we have a lot of things that are told about what Jesus did and said in the Gospels? Do you ever think about what's not told us in the Gospels? Jesus is with these guys for 3.5 years. Think of all the time that isn't mentioned, just sitting around a campfire, just hanging out, talking. One day I stepped back and looked at my life and I realized, the experiences that have been most formative to me have usually been kind of these unscripted, unplanned, just a couple of friends in a kitchen at midnight just talking about things. And just those are some of the most formative, meaningful moments in my life. It was through relationship. Now, the problem, though, is that, of course, relationship takes time. So that's why I want to speak to the time factor. So how do you have time for relationships like these? And I want to give you one tip. The tip is, discipleship is less about adding something to your calendar. It's adding someone. So just for a minute, take a moment to think about someone in your life that you feel God is calling you to invest in. Maybe that could be a son or a daughter or a young adult or a student. Maybe it can be a neighbor. Maybe it can be just a friend that you haven't connected with in a while. The next time you go to the grocery store, why not take that person with you? You have to get groceries. Everyone has to get groceries. Or, the next time you have a couple hours of errands to do or laundry to fold, why not just invite them to do that with you? These are all things that you just have to get done. But you, instead of adding something to your schedule, you can add someone to your schedule. And I think you'll find that sometimes those life-on-life experiences are where discipleship really happens. So number one, grace. Number two, time. And then our third and final word, sincere. And all I want to say about this one is that this cannot be a project. This must be a real relationship. One of the most convicting verses in the whole Bible to me is Romans 12, verse 9. Love must be sincere. Don't you just hate this? It's so much easier to fake love than it is to actually really, sincerely, truly love one another from the heart. And so ask yourself, do I genuinely love my fellow believers? Do I genuinely derive joy from someone that I have the privilege of walking alongside? And if you're anything like me, this is my final confession this morning, you know that you don't. I don't. There's nothing harder in the world than becoming a person of sincere love. And that's why, to become a person of relationship, there's one final thing that we need. And that one final thing that we need, it's to know the person of relationship. We need to know the person of relationship. When Jesus was born, we know from Luke chapter 2 that he had a father until at least age 12. You might remember that story where his mom and dad, Mary and Joseph, lose him when they're visiting Jerusalem. And it says he's 12 years old. So at least until he's 12, he had an earthly mother, earthly father. But tradition says that at some time after that, Joseph, his earthly father, died. And so what this tells us is that Jesus knew what it was to lose his father figure. Of course, on the flip side, he's also a demonstration of how having a heavenly father can more than compensate for that lack. But in a letter about the father-son relationship that Timothy had, I think it's all but probable that the relationship that Paul had with Timothy, it was actually modeled after the same kind of relationship that Jesus had with his disciples. Now why? Why were the disciples able to enjoy that kind of relationship with Jesus? Why was Timothy able to enjoy that kind of relationship with Paul? And the answer is that it wasn't just that Jesus lost his earthly father. He lost the Father. we said at the beginning, God's a God of relationship. From all eternity, the Father's been loving the Son's been loving the Father. In this incredibly glorious, infinite feedback loop of love, our God is relational at his very core. Which is why what happened on the cross just completely is almost incomprehensible. Because on the cross, Jesus voluntarily lost it all. He didn't just lose his life when he died in our place as our substitute. But on the cross, Jesus was cut off from relationship. Jesus was cut off from relationship with his Father so that we would never have to be. So that we would never have to be without a father figure, without a relationship ever again. And do you see that when you grasp that, when you look at and see what he lost for your sake, that's what transforms you into a person of love. That's what gives you a heart to be to do what he did. And so just as we close here, I'm gonna offer a prayer for us. And as we do, I just want to invite you to consider, what does this mean for you? Is there a person that God is calling you to come alongside in order to invest in relationally in the very way that we see Paul and Timothy doing here this morning? You know that I work with young adults, and I'll tell you that one of the things that is just one of the most pivotal things I think that can happen to a person in their young adulthood, and I say this because this happened to me and it changed my life, is to have someone come alongside you who's older to invest in you. There are people in this room who have so much to offer. You may not think you do, but you do. And there are people out there who need what you have. And vice versa, younger people. You have things that the older generation needs, and you need to be able to invest in them too. So let me just, as we pray, I'm going to invite you just to have the Spirit of God search you and to have you ask this question: who is that person? God, is there someone you're calling me to invest in relationally for your name's sake? Let me pray. Heavenly Father, thank you that at the heart of who you are and just the heart of this universe are relationships of love. Father, I pray that if we have been closed to relationship, whether deeper relationship with you, whether to opening ourselves up in love and vulnerability to greater depth of relationship with you or with other believers, that, Father, you would speak to us right now, that you would give us the courage to let others in. And Father, I pray that you would also mobilize us to be those who deeply desire and deeply act out the kind of relationship that we've seen today. God, help us to do that. Help us be in touch with the way that you're the great example, the great model of what relationship looks like. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.